Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be here, to be invited to participate in this debate. You may know there's some others that I'm hoping to be invited to participate in quite soon. Those of you who follow British politics will know what I mean. But actually, I'm not going to talk about that today. What I'm going to talk about is focus on the fact that today is World Food Day. Now, what that does officially is marks the founding of the UN Food and Agriculture Organisation. But what it's informally come to mean, and what it really does mean, I think, is a focus on hunger, a day to really think about people going hungry. And it's still a reality, despite Millennium Development Goals, despite the huge wealth, the huge resource consumption of the world. There are still more than 800 million people in the world who regularly go to bed hungry. And thinking for a second about my involvement with the Fawcett Society and my long history of feminism, 60% of the people who go to bed hungry regularly are women. And that's something worth thinking about. Hunger kills more people each year than malaria, TB and AIDS combined. But we don't have a food shortage. There is no shortage of food in the world. There's more than enough produced every year to feed everybody, although a third of that, 1.3 billion tonnes, is lost or wasted. And this is a truly global problem. When we think about hunger, we probably mostly think about the global south. But actually, last year, and this figure's gone up since the last time I looked it up, 20% of Americans last year relied on food stamps to feed themselves. 1 in 5 Americans needs benefits to eat. And nearly 15% weren't eating adequately even with that food stamp help. 15% of Americans don't get enough food. This is, and I think it's worth thinking about this for a second, I think by any definition that fits my definition of a failed economy. And you might argue a failed state, but certainly a failed economy. It's a cautionary tale for those who are thinking about development of national progress and what it actually means. And if you're going to think about replacing the grossly misleading model of gross domestic product as a measure of national progress, then the kind of direction that in the Green Party we certainly look towards is a traffic light measure of looking at a series of the state of the natural world, the state of the social world, the state of the economy, and saying we want to keep all of those above a red light level. Then I think saying no hunger, no one unable to feed themselves, would be a pretty good place to start. And so I've started global, but I'm going to come local and come to Britain, because you might know that last year 1 million Britons depended on food banks, depended on charity to actually feed themselves. This in the world's 6th richest economy. And one of the things that actually came out today was the fact that we've now crossed over the line. The majority of those people are now have households with at least one person in work. We have such a low pay economy that people who are working simply aren't able to feed themselves. But of course there's other aspects of Britain's food problems, hunger problems. You might have learnt through the horse meat scandal, which I'm sure you'll all remember since it made an awful lot of headlines, that Britons eat twice the number of ready meals compared to the rest of Europe in terms of per head. And you might have heard the phrase food deserts, and how many of our poorest communities simply don't have access to fresh fruit and vegetables. You might have to go and remember these are people who almost never have access to a car, and a £1.50 bus fare is out of the question. You might have to go a couple of miles to find anywhere in parts of Britain where, and I'm talking in cities here, where you can buy fresh fruit and vegetables. So one place to start when we're really thinking about food and hunger is really what we're actually talking about really is poverty. In a society in which nearly 1 in 5 workers is on less than a living wage, in which the benefits that are paid are not enough to live on, and which benefit recipients are regularly subject to utterly arbitrary sanctions, and workers are first into self-employment, and often very low paid self-employment, it's not surprising that the hunger and the fear of hunger hangs over many households. Just to actually put a human face on this, the Mirror this week had a simple story of working poverty. a supermarket worker, and as she herself said, it was particularly ironic. She worked on a checkout, scanning food, and yet she's relying on a food bank to feed herself, and sometimes she says she can't look at the food because she's so hungry and she can't afford to buy any of it. Her name's Angela Warren from Bathgate, and this is her own words. I challenge any of them, Cameron, Clegg, Osborne, to take my wages and make 28 breakfasts, 28 lunch and 28 dinners from £88. That's what I have left after my bills. It can't be done, not month after month. But poverty is probably beyond the total range of what I want to talk about today, although I did want to say that, first of all, hunger is a poverty problem. But we also very much, when we need to think about food cultures, need to think about health and healthy food, good food, varied, fresh food is absolutely critical. And that, as I've said, in terms of food deserts, is not available to many people. Diet-related ill health costs the NHS £5.8 billion a year. Now, particularly people on the right of politics tend to look at individual behaviour and say people are doing all the wrong things. And one of the problems is that people do get an awful lot of misinformation. I was talking to a man recently who'd been on a nutrition course, and he expressed to me in tones of total astonishment, but I always thought breakfast cereal and breakfast bars and things were healthy because that's what all the adverts say. And people are bombarded with that message. And the kind of health messages about unprocessed food, about, an apple a day, about all of those simple ways to eat healthily, they're only a tiny fraction of the messages that people actually hear. And also there's a question of misery, of tiredness, stress, worry. Then a soft drink and a chocolate bar can look pretty attractive when you're feeling like that, whereas an apple looks like a bit more hard work in an already tough day. Particularly, as you might have found if you came here this morning via a train station in Britain, very often you'll be offered, if you want to buy a newspaper, you'll be offered an enormous, pretty poor, but enormous bar of chocolate at a special discount price, because that's what we all need in Britain, is more junk food, more or less shoved down people's throats. And yet that's what our culture is doing. And if we go back to those ready meals, we think about those ready meals, then we have the situation, and I've actually seen this myself, stand near a tube station in London and watch the workers coming home at 7 or 8 in the evening. And we have some of the longest working hours in Europe. And people stagger home from work and they're unpaid overtime, and it's 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and they just fall into the Tesco Metro or the Sainsbury's, whatever they're called, and walk out with a ready meal and stick it in the microwave. And you can't blame them. It's not the fault of the individual behaviour here. Our whole society is set up to generate that kind of food culture. And there's also the fact of cost. Now, that tired worker at 7:30 or 8 in the evening probably isn't going to start peeling turnips and cutting up potatoes for a vegetable stew. But they're actually going to struggle to pay for that, even that most basic kind of healthy food. In 2002, 1,000 calories of healthy food cost $5.65, while unhealthy food, there's a whole background to this which I can give anyone who's interested, but unhealthy food cost $1.77, so it cost about a third as much. Now we're up to $7.49 versus £2.50. In pound terms, I'm not talking about in real terms allowing for inflation, in pound terms, a frozen pizza is now 25% cheaper than it was in 2002. And I can assure you a frozen pizza is not a healthy meal. And a donut costs 2% more than it did in 2002. By contrast, tin tuna costs 77% more than it did in 2002, and fresh tomatoes 40% more. So what we've done is we've got a culture where everything you should eat is getting more expensive and difficult, and everything that you shouldn't eat is getting broadly cheaper. And so that's the negative stuff. The good news is, since it's early in the morning and you've got a long day ahead of you, I'm now going to focus on some positive stuff. Some good cultural things, of positive things that are happening in Britain, and what we might think about culturally around the world, of how we can all learn from each other. And I'm going to start with a place called Todmorden, and that's not just because I came from Ilkley in Yorkshire just down the road this morning on a very early train, which explains why I came steaming in here looking a bit hot under the collar. And in Todmorden, and if you haven't heard about it, I really urge you to look it up, there's a scheme called the Incredible Edible. And aside from anything else, it's actually enormous fun. And it's been spreading like wildfire around Britain and beyond. And really, I need to paint a picture for you here about this. And it's a picture of walking past the police station, which is the kind of thing that even the most law-abiding tend to put their head down and sort of scuttle along a little bit. But in Todmorden, you should stop and have a look, because the front of the police station, which used to be just a concrete yard, now has a vegetable garden in it. And at the right season, at the right time, that vegetable garden will have a sign saying, "Please pick me." And it might be, now there might be some cobs of corn. It's probably not quite too late for cobs of corn. And there might be some instructions on how to cook them if it's something that you might need some help with. And so you can stroll into the police station yard, pick yourself some nice fresh food and continue on home. It's almost as easy as, well, it is as easy as falling into the supermarket. Easier than falling into the supermarket, and it doesn't cost you anything. If you walk along the canal, which is in the centre of Todmorden, there's a whole lot of blackcurrant bushes. And again, there'll be recipes up on the fence suggesting how you might like to cook these. You almost literally fall over healthy food wherever you go in Todmorden, and it's all free. Now, it's important to understand what this actually isn't. This isn't autarky. This isn't an attempt to feed a town of 15,000 people, and they'll probably forgive me for saying, with not possibly the ideal climate for growing everything in the world. It's not an attempt to feed Todmorden with its own produce. First of all, it's an attempt to increase the understanding of food. It's the idea that food is something that you grow, it's something that's grown, not something that comes to you in a pointlessly complex set of 3 lots of plastic in the supermarket, and all looking identical shaped, identical coloured, and all the rest of being chucked out because they don't match up with those colours. I doubt, and this is one of my favourite accounts, this is from a survey in 2013, a survey of the whole of Britain found that 1/3 of children, primary school children, thought that cheese came from plants. But I doubt that there are many children in Todmorden who think that cheese comes from plants. They're going to know a lot better than that. And one of the most fascinating places of all, I think, in Todmorden is I visited the everything edible garden outside the health centre. And the volunteer said to me, "Why would you put a plant outside a health centre that isn't edible? And think about what the prescription the doctor can offer. Just stroll outside and pick a couple of apples. Free, doesn't cost the NHS anything, and it's a wonderful model of how you can eat healthily, easily, and the idea that you can just pick your food." Now Todmorden is the kind of city side of things, but I'm going to sort of step outside the city and the town now and think about market gardening, what really has been the staple of existence of human food ever since Neolithic times. And it's not that long ago. I can almost remember it as a child, and the accent comes from Australia, but I think Britain was the same, that towns and cities were surrounded by a ring of market gardens that were producing a whole wide range of food, very fresh. It got probably from the garden to your plate in a day or so. It was ecologically rich because you had a whole variety of crops there, great particularly for the pollinators, the bees, one of the issues that we're thinking about hugely in environmental terms at the moment. And labour intensive. And that's one of the words that I'd like to think we might want to reclaim as a positive, not a negative. Labour intensive, we need jobs, we need good jobs, we need business opportunities. And growing food should be an opportunity for lots of people, and market gardens is the perfect example of this. And this is slowly being rebuilt, and the sad thing is we'd almost lost this culture, and we've had to bring the culture back. On the outskirts of London, not far from here, is Organic Lea. That's LEA for anyone who's looking for it. It's a cooperative owned by its members. It's in an old nursery that used to belong to the council, and they got it on a cheap lease from the council. And the workers there, they pay themselves a living wage. They work hard, but they get the results of their own labour, and they really love what they're doing. It's very obvious when you visit it. They sell both door to door with offering a simple bag, a week's worth bag of fruit and vegetables, and they very deliberately target poorer areas of the community, not the kind of middle class areas where those kind of schemes traditionally go. And they also sell in the local markets, not the farmers' markets, which are great things, but in the local markets where people go when they're really looking for the cheapest of the cheap food and everything else. And that is one really excellent model, small scale, but it really requires a lot of dedication. So what I'm going to do now is skip over to Wales and the River Garden Market Garden, which is a pretty classic, when you look at it first glance, it's a fairly classic market garden of about 10 acres. When I visited, the cucumbers were doing spectacularly well in the unheated greenhouse, although I discovered it's actually very hard to have your photo taken with a cucumber in a manner that doesn't end up saying, no, we can't use that photo. It's really tricky. But the strawberries were also lovely, I do have to say. And it was a project that actually grew out of a farmer's market that found that they often didn't have the kind of food basics to sell that they wanted to sell. So what they've actually got is funding from the government in Cardiff to actually help to develop a commercial model to say how, we're experimenting, we know things might go wrong at times, this is an experiment. But what we're going to do is do this and see how we can model it so that lots and lots of people could run small businesses on 10 or 20 acres, growing large amounts of food. And one of the things they've already learnt is that what you really need is a cooperative cluster, one farm on its own. They've got a lot of isolated things they need to buy, like a tractor, that they're not using most of the time. So it would make sense to have a cluster of, say, 10 or 12 farms, and they could share lots of equipment as well as sharing skills and knowledge. And they're running now that 10 or 20 acres, providing jobs for 4 people. Good jobs. A couple of them are apprentices. They hope their apprentices will go on and start up farms of their own. But they're providing good quality, hard work, but decent jobs, decent paying jobs, business opportunities, chances for people to do agriculture in a different kind of way. But we also, of course, need the big arable farming, the big scale stuff. But what we don't need is the kind of intensive monoculture that too often stretches far into the distance. And coming down on the train from Yorkshire this morning, I saw quite a bit of this. Neat, groomed, sterile, and dangerously vulnerable to diseases and pests or climate mishap, and hugely carbon intensive. And one of the things, those of you who are visiting from around the world, you might look at the British countryside and think it looks pretty pretty. And it does look quite chocolate box quite a lot of the time. But what we're looking at increasingly, and if you come here in the spring, you'll see fields of rapeseed, bright yellow flowers, and everyone goes, oh, isn't that pretty and isn't that nice, all those flowers. What people don't realise is that to grow that, you're almost certainly using huge quantities of slug pellets. That's metaldehyde, which is a really nasty chemical, but it's also killing off, spraying a lot, killing off the invertebrates. And that's significantly related to the fact that in Britain, if you think of the symbol of the British countryside, you'll often perhaps think of a hedgehog. It's a nice, cute, cuddly-looking, if not actually cuddly, animal. But what people don't realise is that the number of hedgehogs in Britain, that great symbol of the British countryside, the number of hedgehogs is declining every year by 38%. In the last 10 years, every year it's gone down by 38%. So that's an exponential fall, year on year, each year 38% down from the previous year. And that's faster than the tigers are declining in the wild. So when we start thinking about lost animals and lost species, and the fact that the figures that came out a week or so back that showed that we've lost, around the globe, we've lost 50% of our wildlife. There's 50% animals in the world now than there was 40 years ago. Don't just think of the classic exotic tigers and that, think of hedgehogs as well. But there is a different way of doing even this larger scale kind of farming. And there's also a question of how much of this we need to do, because a lot of that farming, both here in Britain and around the world, is actually producing grain, producing protein to feed animals. And that's one of the things that, culturally speaking, we have to stop. The Centre for Alternative Technology Zero Carbon Britain report has some answers here. If we start with the sort of climate change aspect, which helps you address lots of other issues as well, agricultural food production accounts for about 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions in Britain. But a lot of that is from meat production. So if you drastically reduce the meat production, particularly stop the factory farming, stop feeding grain to animals, only feed animals on grass, let the pigs run around in the orchard, those kind of things, then you drastically cut your carbon emissions. And overall, I'd recommend you look at this if this is an area you're interested in, the Centre for Alternative Technology says we can cut our emissions from farming to 27% of 2010 levels, whilst significantly increasing our food production. we can cut our imports of food from 42% to 17%. So Britain, on these figures, can't quite feed itself, but it can go a lot further towards that. And, you know, personally, as I said, I'm not in favour of autarky. I like my morning cup of coffee. And we're never going to grow coffee in Britain, or at least if we do, things will have got so bad we really don't want to think about it. So, you know, we're always going to want to import some things. And one of the things that, you know, is worth thinking about is our countryside might look a bit less tidy. It mightn't look so spectacularly neat rows and all those endless furrows of ground being ploughed up. But we could produce more and would certainly be a whole lot ecologically healthier. And then finally I get to the sort of final part of the food culture, which is where you buy the food. And there's a positive model just up the road from here. You might have seen it, it has been on television quite a lot. It's called the People's Supermarket. And it's a cooperative owned by its members. It aims to use local suppliers whenever it can. We are in the middle of London, so local does stretch a little bit, but more or less local. It cooks ready meals on the site, particularly so if we've bought too many tomatoes and there's lots of really, really luscious ripe tomatoes, but at the point where they're going to turn into sog pretty quickly, we cook them into ready meals so they don't get wasted. And you know, why don't we have anywhere we sell fresh food? There should be some way of making sure that you actually use, you know, food that's in that kind of state, because it's actually lovely food at that point. Let's use it. And it actually really focuses on promoting fruit and vegetables. When you come into the shop, that's the first thing you find. You know, you can find, and they found that they had to, for commercial reasons, sell the chocolate bars and the crisps and everything else. But you have to go past the fruit and veg to get to that. And one of the interesting things about this shop is, compared to other stores of similar sizes, other sort of traditional supermarkets, double the percentage of its turnover is fruit and vegetables compared to your average store like that. So simply just putting the fruit and veg out the front has an impact. And you know, the kind of things it's promoting, instead of that cheap chocolate bar, it does promote beer, but it's local craft-made beer from here in London. And it's not the kind of thing that you're going to buy a whole slab of 24 of and go home and drink the lot. You know, it's not cheap, but it's nice beer, and it's something that you drink in a different kind of way. The Exeter Real Food Store is another model, and there's others around the country. So what we're talking about here, and what I'm going to finish on, because I want to allow plenty of time for questions, because I think dialogue's always more interesting than monologue, is a food revolution. It's what we need in Britain, it's what we need in the Commonwealth, it's what we need in the world. And it's what we need, particularly for the global south, not to head in the direction that we've gone over the past few decades, but to head straight in this direction. And that's towards good food, not necessarily cheap food, but good food, and an economic system that means everyone can afford that good food. It means not fast food, but convenient, healthy food. And it means food that tastes an awful lot better, which is a nice extra bonus. And it's got to become the norm for our health and the health of our planet. Now, I've shared some British experiences, but I think, and this is where I've got a real challenge, particularly for those of you who think about the Commonwealth or involved in the Commonwealth. I think thinking about food, thinking about that most essential human right of meeting people's right to food, and working out how we feed ourselves in an increasingly food insecure world is an absolutely critical, I think it should be a critical part of the Commonwealth's work. I think it's something that we should be a really major strand. There should be skill sharing, there should be experience sharing, there should be real ways in which we can all learn from best practice and roll it out around the world. So what I would say is, don't do what we've done. Work out how to do things better and tell us how to do it better. And that, I think, is the kind of cultural sharing on food that we all need, as well as the nice recipes. Nice recipes are good too. Thank you.